The cameras were already rolling when the room fell silent. Flashbulbs exploded like lightning, reporters leaned forward, and in the center of it all stood Michael Jackson, not on a stage, not dancing, not singing, but frozen in a moment that would change his life forever. In 1993, the king of pop wasn't performing for the world. He was being watched, judged, and humiliated. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. Michael Jackson had spent his entire life in the spotlight. From the moment he was a child prodigy in the Jackson 5, he learned how to smile for cameras, how to move to the rhythm of applause, how to carry the weight of the world's expectations on his shoulders. Fame was not something he achieved. It was something he was born into. But nothing in his decades-long career, not even the most ruthless tabloids or the harshest critics, prepared him for what would unfold in 1993. That year, the world did not see Michael Jackson as the artist, the innovator, the humanitarian, or the man who had reshaped global pop culture. Instead, the world saw a headline, an accusation, a scandal, and before the truth could even catch its breath, Michael Jackson was already being tried, not in a courtroom but in the court of public opinion. It began quietly, almost invisibly, like the first crack in a flawless mirror. Behind closed doors, a family dispute was escalating, and whispers were forming. Those whispers would soon become front-page news. Within weeks, Michael Jackson's name, once synonymous with brilliance, magic, and music, was being dragged through the darkest corners of the media landscape. Every channel, every newspaper, every radio station, the same words repeated again and again: accusation, scandal, investigation. The media did not speak in possibilities, it spoke in conclusions. Michael Jackson was no longer portrayed as innocent until proven guilty. He was portrayed as guilty until proven innocent. And the world believed it. The transformation was terrifying in its speed. One day, Michael Jackson was the most celebrated entertainer on Earth. The next, he was the most scrutinized human being alive. Paparazzi chased him relentlessly. Journalists camped outside his home. Helicopters hovered above his gates. The cameras did not rest. They did not sleep. They did not wait for facts. For the first time in his life, Michael Jackson was not being filmed because people loved him. He was being filmed because people wanted to see him fall. Inside his home, behind the high walls of Neverland Ranch, Michael Jackson was unraveling. He had always been sensitive, emotional, deeply connected to his fans, and to the children he sought to protect and uplift. But now, the same world that once embraced him was turning against him. The betrayal cut deeper than any criticism he had ever faced. Friends later recalled that Michael Jackson was confused, devastated, and emotionally shattered. He did not understand how rumors could so quickly become reality in the minds of millions. He did not understand how stories could be written without evidence, how accusations could be repeated without proof, how a man's entire life could be reduced to a single, unproven claim. And yet, every day, the headlines grew darker. The media coverage was not investigative, it was theatrical. Reporters speculated wildly. Talk shows debated his guilt as if it were already established fact. Late-night comedians mocked his pain. Magazine covers displayed his face alongside words like monster, freak, and fallen idol. Michael Jackson was no longer human in the eyes of the media. He was a story, a spectacle, a scandal. But what the media did not show, what they did not want you to know, was the truth unfolding quietly behind the noise. The legal process did not match the media narrative. While the headlines screamed certainty, the investigation told a different story. Law enforcement searched Michael Jackson's home. They examined evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They looked for physical proof. And what they found did not support the story being told on television screens around the world. There was no forensic evidence, no physical confirmation, no medical proof that corroborated the claims being made. Even the descriptions given by the accuser failed to match verified facts about Michael Jackson's body. a detail that, under normal circumstances, would have been enough to raise serious doubt. But doubt did not make headlines. Fear did. Shock did. Humiliation did. Michael Jackson was humiliated not only by the accusations, but by the way they were weaponized. Every private detail of his life became public property. His friendships, his lifestyle, his eccentricities, his childhood trauma, all were twisted, reinterpreted, and presented as evidence of something sinister. The narrative was no longer about what happened. It was about who Michael Jackson was, or who the media wanted him to be. And the story they told was not kind. They portrayed him as strange, unstable, and dangerous. They stripped him of his humanity and replaced it with caricature. They did not show the man who had donated millions to charity, who had visited children's hospitals around the world, who had used his platform to promote peace, love, and unity. They did not show the man who had never had a normal childhood, who had grown up under the pressures of fame, who had learned to find comfort in innocence and imagination. Instead, they showed a villain. And the world watched. Michael Jackson, once the most protected figure in entertainment, suddenly found himself completely exposed. Every move he made was interpreted as suspicious. Every word he spoke was dissected. Every silence was assumed to be an admission of guilt. But the truth, the real truth, is that Michael Jackson was not allowed the presumption of innocence. He was not allowed the dignity of due process. He was not allowed the humanity of doubt. He was humiliated publicly before he was ever judged legally. Behind the scenes, his legal team fought desperately to protect him, not just from legal consequences but from psychological collapse. The pressure was unbearable. Michael Jackson's health deteriorated. He lost weight. He struggled to sleep. He turned to painkillers to cope with physical and emotional agony. In November 1993, just months after the accusations became public, Michael Jackson made a shocking decision. He canceled the remainder of his Dangerous World Tour, a tour that had been sold out across continents. Fans were stunned. Promoters were furious. But Michael Jackson was not physically or mentally capable of continuing. In a statement released to the public, he admitted that he had become dependent on prescription medication to deal with the stress of the investigation and the relentless media scrutiny. He entered a rehabilitation facility. The world watched in confusion. Some saw it as guilt, others saw it as weakness. Few saw it as what it truly was, a man breaking under the weight of a world that had turned against him. The image of Michael Jackson, once untouchable, now appeared fragile, wounded, and isolated. And yet the media did not pause. They did not reflect. They did not ask if they had gone too far. They continued. Every rehab update became a headline. Every rumor became a story. Every whisper became a source close to the situation. Michael Jackson was no longer a person, he was content. Then came the civil settlement in 1994. To the public, this moment became the final nail in the coffin of his reputation. Headlines screamed that Michael Jackson had paid off his accuser. Commentators declared that money equaled guilt. The narrative hardened. The humiliation deepened. But what the media did not explain, and what many still do not understand, is the difference between a civil settlement and a criminal conviction. Michael Jackson did not settle because he was found guilty. He settled because the civil lawsuit threatened to force him into a public trial before the criminal investigation was complete, something his legal team warned would severely compromise his defense. Settling a civil case is not an admission of guilt. It is a legal strategy, often used to avoid prolonged litigation, financial ruin, and emotional destruction. And in Michael Jackson's case, the emotional destruction was already happening. The district attorney publicly stated that the settlement did not affect the criminal investigation. And yet, despite months of investigation, despite intense scrutiny, despite global pressure, prosecutors ultimately announced that there was not enough evidence to file criminal charges. No arrest, no trial, no conviction, no proof. And yet the damage had already been done. Michael Jackson had been humiliated on a global scale. His reputation had been shattered. His name had been permanently stained in the public imagination. And the media, the same media that had confidently declared his guilt, quietly moved on. No apology, no retraction, no headline that said, "Michael Jackson cleared." No acknowledgement of error. The story ended not with justice, but with silence. But for Michael Jackson, the story did not end. The trauma followed him. It haunted him. It reshaped him. He became more guarded, more isolated, more withdrawn. His trust in the world, and especially in the media, was permanently broken. The joy that once radiated from him in interviews and public appearances was replaced by caution, sadness, and restraint. Yet despite the pain, Michael Jackson did not stop creating. He did not stop giving. He did not stop believing in the power of music. He returned to the studio. He returned to the stage. He returned to his fans, though he was never quite the same. Every performance after 1993 carried an invisible weight. Every smile was tinged with sorrow. Every song felt like a silent plea for understanding. And then in 2003, a decade later, the nightmare returned. New allegations emerged. The media pounced once again. The same patterns repeated, the same headlines, the same assumptions, the same rush to judgment. This time, however, Michael Jackson fought back, not with silence but in court. In 2005, after one of the most publicized trials in history, Michael Jackson was found not guilty on all counts. Every charge, every allegation, every claim, not guilty. The courtroom erupted, his fans cried, his family embraced him. For a brief moment, justice seemed to prevail. But the media reaction was not what many expected. There was no celebration. There was no apology. There was no reckoning. Instead, the headlines were subdued. The coverage was cautious. The tone was skeptical. Some outlets focused on his demeanor rather than the verdict. Others suggested that he had escaped rather than been vindicated. Once again, Michael Jackson was denied the dignity of innocence. The truth, however, had finally spoken. But it spoke too late. The damage had already been done, not only to Michael Jackson's career, but to his soul. The humiliation of 1993 had never left him. It had shaped his relationships. It had shaped his art. It had shaped his health. It had shaped his life. Behind the public image, behind the fame, behind the music, there was a man who had been broken by a system that claimed to seek truth but often prioritized spectacle. And that is the story the media does not want you to know. Not because it is secret, but because it is uncomfortable. It forces us to confront the power of narrative. It forces us to question the role of journalism. It forces us to acknowledge how easily we accept stories without evidence, how quickly we judge without proof, how readily we participate in the destruction of a human being. Michael Jackson was not just humiliated by accusations. He was humiliated by silence. By the silence of those who knew better. By the silence of those who could have spoken up. By the silence of a media industry that rarely admits its mistakes. The tragedy is not only what happened to Michael Jackson. The tragedy is what it reveals about us. We live in a world where headlines travel faster than truth, where scandal outpaces investigation, where emotion overrides evidence, where reputations can be destroyed in hours and never fully restored, even after innocence is proven. Michael Jackson became a symbol not of guilt, but of what happens when the world confuses accusation with conviction. And yet through it all, his music endured. His art endured. His legacy endured. Songs like Heal the World, Man in the Mirror, and Earth Song took on new meaning. They were no longer just messages to society. They were messages from a wounded soul seeking redemption, understanding, and peace. In his final years, Michael Jackson attempted a comeback. The This Is It concerts were announced. The world was watching again, but this time with anticipation rather than suspicion. Fans were hopeful. The king of pop was ready to reclaim his throne. But fate had other plans. In June 2009, Michael Jackson passed away unexpectedly. The world stopped. The same media that had once humiliated him now mourned him. The same headlines that had once accused him now praised him. The same outlets that had once doubted him now called him a legend. The irony was devastating. In death, Michael Jackson received the respect he had been denied in life. Millions gathered in grief. Tributes poured in from around the world. Artists credited him as their greatest influence. Fans wept openly. And suddenly, the narrative changed. Michael Jackson was no longer the scandal. He was the icon. But for those who had watched him suffer in 1993, the pain remained. Because no tribute, no memorial, no praise could undo the humiliation he endured. No apology could restore the years lost to stress, fear, and isolation. No celebration could erase the scars left by false narratives. And yet his story offers us something powerful. A lesson, a warning, a call to reflection. It reminds us that behind every headline is a human being. That behind every accusation is a life. That behind every story is a responsibility. Michael Jackson's humiliation in 1993 was not just a moment in entertainment history. It was a turning point in media culture. It exposed the dangers of sensationalism. It revealed the cost of speculation. It demonstrated how quickly truth can be buried under noise. And it showed how difficult it is to rebuild a reputation once it has been destroyed. But it also showed the resilience of the human spirit. Despite everything, Michael Jackson continued to love. He continued to create. He continued to give. He continued to believe in the goodness of the world, even when the world failed him. His fans remained loyal. His music remained timeless. His message remained powerful. And perhaps in the end, that is the most important part of his story. Not the accusations, not the headlines, not the humiliation, but the legacy. A legacy built on compassion, creativity, and courage. A legacy that survived scandal, scrutiny, and suffering. A legacy that continues to inspire generations. Michael Jackson was humiliated in 1993, but he was not defeated. The media may have tried to define him by a moment of controversy, but history will define him by a lifetime of impact. And now the story belongs to us, not as a tale of scandal, but as a reminder to seek truth, to question narratives, and to protect the dignity of those who cannot protect themselves. Because the real story they don't want you to know is not about guilt. It's about humanity. It's about injustice. It's about survival. It's about Michael Jackson. And his story deserves to be told, not through whispers, not through rumors, not through sensational headlines, but through truth, empathy, and understanding. The story does not end with remembrance. It does not end with applause, tributes, or even justice. The story continues in the quiet moments, in the unanswered questions, in the way Michael Jackson's name still echoes through conversations, debates, and hearts across the world. Because when a man is humiliated on a global scale, the aftermath does not vanish with time. It lingers. It shapes memory. It rewrites history unless someone is willing to tell the full truth. In the years following his death, something remarkable began to happen. The world slowly started to look back, not through the lens of scandal, but through the lens of context. People began to revisit the footage, the interviews, the legal documents, the timelines. They began to notice inconsistencies. They began to question the narratives that had once been accepted without hesitation. They began to ask the uncomfortable question, what if we were wrong? For decades, Michael Jackson had been a symbol of excellence. But in the aftermath of 1993, he also became a symbol of something darker, the fragility of reputation in the age of mass media. His story became a case study in how quickly admiration can turn into suspicion, how easily love can turn into judgment, and how brutally public opinion can be weaponized. And yet, the more people looked back, the clearer the picture became. They saw a man who had been isolated since childhood, thrust into stardom before he could even understand the meaning of privacy. They saw a boy who had never known normalcy, who had been trained to perform before he had learned to play. They saw a child who had grown up surrounded by adults, cameras, expectations, and pressure, not peers, playgrounds, or peace. Michael Jackson did not lose his childhood, it was taken from him. And as he grew older, he sought to recreate what he had missed. He built Neverland Ranch not as a fantasy playground, but as a sanctuary. A place of imagination, innocence, and wonder. A place where laughter replaced applause, where rides replaced rehearsals, where children, especially sick and disadvantaged children, could feel joy without judgment. But the media did not tell that story. They told a different one. They turned his love for innocence into suspicion. They turned his generosity into accusation. They turned his kindness into controversy. And when the allegations emerged in 1993, they did not pause to ask why a man who had spent his life helping children would suddenly become their enemy. They did not question the timing. They did not examine the motives. They did not demand evidence before broadcasting conclusions. They simply pressed publish. The humiliation that followed was not just emotional, it was existential. Michael Jackson was no longer seen as a person. He was seen as a problem, a risk, a liability. Companies distanced themselves. Sponsors hesitated. Industry insiders whispered. Doors closed. Even those who privately believed in his innocence often remained silent, afraid of backlash, criticism, or association. And so, Michael Jackson found himself surrounded by people, and yet completely alone. But the truth has a strange way of resurfacing. Years later, journalists, researchers, and fans began uncovering details that had been buried beneath the noise. They revisited court documents. They analyzed statements. They examined contradictions. They compared timelines. And what they found challenged everything the media had once claimed. They discovered that the original accusations in 1993 were deeply entangled in a business dispute, a dispute over a film project that had fallen apart, leading to financial tension between the accuser's family and Michael Jackson's team. They discovered that the civil lawsuit had been filed before any criminal charges, a strategic move that raised serious questions about intent. They discovered that key details in the accusations had changed over time, not once, not twice, but repeatedly. They discovered that medical examinations did not support the claims. They discovered that investigators struggled to find corroborating evidence. They discovered that prosecutors, under immense public pressure, still could not bring criminal charges, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. And yet, none of this made front-page news. The truth did not trend. Silence did. And Michael Jackson lived the rest of his life, carrying a burden he did not deserve. But what may be even more painful than the humiliation itself is the way it shaped the world's relationship with him, even after his death. In 2019, a controversial documentary reignited the allegations, presenting a one-sided narrative that reopened wounds and reignited debate. Once again, the media embraced accusation over verification. Once again, Michael Jackson was put on trial, not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. Once again, he was denied the dignity of defense. Once again, his voice was absent. Once again, the narrative moved faster than the facts. But this time, something was different. This time, people pushed back. This time, fans, researchers, and independent journalists challenged the claims publicly. They dissected timelines. They highlighted inconsistencies. They pointed out contradictions. They questioned motives. They demanded evidence. They did what the media should have done in 1993. And slowly, the conversation began to shift. Not toward blind defense, not toward denial, but toward skepticism, healthy, necessary skepticism. Toward a recognition that stories, no matter how emotionally compelling, must still be grounded in truth. Toward an understanding that justice cannot exist without fairness. Toward a realization that even the most shocking allegations deserve scrutiny. Michael Jackson's story forced the world to confront a difficult truth. We are often quicker to believe the worst than to investigate the truth. And that truth has consequences. Not just for celebrities, not just for public figures, but for everyone. Because when we accept narratives without evidence, we participate in injustice. When we share stories without verification, we amplify harm. When we judge without knowledge, we become part of the problem. Michael Jackson's humiliation in 1993 was not an isolated incident. It was a warning. A warning about the power of media. A warning about the dangers of sensationalism. A warning about the fragility of reputation. A warning about the cost of silence. And a warning about what happens when truth is sacrificed for headlines. But Michael Jackson's story is not just a story of humiliation. It is also a story of resilience. Despite everything he endured, he continued to create. Despite everything he lost, he continued to give. Despite everything he suffered, he continued to love. He did not retreat from the world, he reached out to it. He did not harden his heart, he opened it wider. He did not become bitter, he became deeper. His music after 1993 reflected his pain, his hope, his longing for justice, and his desire for healing. Songs like Stranger in Moscow captured his isolation. They Don't Care About Us echoed his frustration with injustice. Smile reflected his quiet resilience. You Are Not Alone expressed his yearning for connection. Childhood revealed his deepest wounds. These were not just songs. They were confessions. They were prayers. They were letters to a world that had misunderstood him. And yet the world kept listening, even if it did not fully understand. Michael Jackson's fans never left him. They stood by him through scandal, through trials, through rumors, and through silence. They defended him when no one else would. They believed in him when others doubted. They supported him when he was most vulnerable. And in doing so, they preserved something the media tried to destroy, his humanity. Because at the heart of Michael Jackson's story is not fame, not fortune, not controversy, but humanity. A man who laughed, a man who cried, a man who loved, a man who suffered, a man who hoped, a man who believed in a better world, a man who wanted to make a difference, a man who paid a terrible price for being different. The humiliation of 1993 did not define Michael Jackson. It wounded him. It scarred him. It changed him. But it did not destroy him. He continued to dream. He continued to inspire. He continued to connect with people across cultures, generations, and borders. He continued to use his voice, not just to entertain but to heal. And even now, years after his death, his voice still echoes. Not just in music, but in memory, in conversation, in reflection, in the hearts of millions. Michael Jackson's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What responsibility does the media have to the truth? What responsibility do we have as consumers of information? How easily are we influenced by narratives? How quickly do we judge without knowing? How often do we confuse accusation with conviction? How many lives have been damaged by stories that were never fully verified? How many reputations have been destroyed without justice? How many voices have been silenced by scandal? Michael Jackson's humiliation in 1993 is not just his story. It is our story. It is the story of a society that often prioritizes entertainment over empathy, speed over accuracy, drama over dignity. It is the story of how quickly we can turn against those we once loved. It is the story of how difficult it is to undo harm once it has been done. And it is the story of why truth matters, not eventually, not sometimes, but always. Because once truth is delayed, damage is done. Once damage is done, lives are changed. Once lives are changed, nothing is ever the same. Michael Jackson lived with the consequences of 1993 for the rest of his life. He lived with fear. He lived with mistrust. He lived with isolation. He lived with pain. He lived with misunderstanding. And yet he also lived with love. He lived with loyalty. He lived with faith. He lived with creativity. He lived with purpose. He lived with hope. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of his story. Not that he was humiliated, but that he endured. That he survived. That he continued. That he did not let the world's cruelty extinguish his light. His story reminds us that resilience is not loud. It is quiet. It is persistent. It is patient. It is invisible to those who only look for spectacle. But it is powerful. Michael Jackson's resilience lives in his music. It lives in his fans. It lives in his legacy. It lives in the lessons we can learn from his life. It lives in the conversations we continue to have. It lives in the questions we continue to ask. It lives in the truth that continues to emerge. Because the truth does not need to be shouted. It only needs to be told. And now it is being told. Not through headlines. Not through rumors. Not through speculation. But through reflection. Through research. Through conversation. Through courage. Michael Jackson's story deserves more than sensationalism. It deserves more than judgment. It deserves more than silence. It deserves understanding. It deserves compassion. It deserves truth. And the truth is this. Michael Jackson was humiliated in 1993, not by evidence, not by verdict, not by justice, but by a system that prioritized narrative over nuance, drama over dignity, and spectacle over humanity. He was humiliated by a world that forgot he was human. But he was not defined by that humiliation. He was defined by his art. He was defined by his heart. He was defined by his impact. He was defined by his resilience. He was defined by his legacy. And that legacy continues, not as a scandal but as a reminder. A reminder to seek truth. A reminder to question narratives. A reminder to protect dignity. A reminder to practice empathy. A reminder to value justice. A reminder to remember humanity. Michael Jackson's story is not over. It continues every time someone listens to his music. It continues every time someone questions a headline. It continues every time someone chooses compassion over condemnation. It continues every time someone stands up for truth. It continues every time someone refuses to judge without knowing. It continues every time someone remembers that behind every story is a person. And perhaps that is the most powerful part of his legacy. Not the records he broke, not the awards he won, not the stages he conquered, but the conversations he continues to inspire. Conversations about justice. Conversations about truth. Conversations about humanity. Conversations about responsibility. Conversations about compassion. Michael Jackson's humiliation in 1993 was a tragedy. But his story does not end in tragedy. It ends in reflection. It ends in understanding. It ends in truth. It ends in legacy. And now it ends with us. Because what we choose to do with his story matters. What we choose to believe matters. What we choose to share matters. What we choose to question matters. What we choose to defend matters. What we choose to protect matters. Because the next Michael Jackson, the next person humiliated by headlines, judged by rumors, and condemned by narratives may not be famous. They may not have millions of fans. They may not have a platform. They may not have a voice. They may not have a defense. They may not survive. And so, Michael Jackson's story is not just a reflection on the past. It is a responsibility for the future. A responsibility to be better. A responsibility to do better. A responsibility to demand truth. A responsibility to protect dignity. A responsibility to practice empathy. A responsibility to remember humanity. And if we learn anything from Michael Jackson's life, from his brilliance, his pain, his humiliation, and his resilience, let it be this: no one deserves to be destroyed by a story that has not been proven. No one deserves to be humiliated without justice. No one deserves to be judged without evidence. No one deserves to be silenced without defense. No one deserves to be forgotten without truth. Michael Jackson deserved better. And so does everyone else. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video so more people can hear the truth and learn from the past. Together, we can change how stories are told and how humanity is treated.